The wind cut sharp through the canyon, carrying with it the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and something far more dangerous: silence. In that silence, you could hear the faint shuffle of boots on frozen ground, the click of a revolver's hammer being thumbed back, and somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable war cry of the Comanche. It wasn't the kind of sound that simply reached your ears. It crawled down your spine, reminding you exactly where you were and just how thin the line was between living and dying. The troops of the 4th U.S. Cavalry had ridden directly into a test of ability, nerve, and survival in the Rocky Canyon region of the Texas Panhandle in the winter of 1868. This was no ordinary skirmish. This was a clash between two very different weapons, two very different ways of fighting. The recently supplied Colt revolvers, made of modern steel, were placed on one side to give the cavalry an advantage in firepower. On the other, the Comanche lance, a weapon older than the United States itself, but one the Comanche had mastered so thoroughly it became almost an extension of the rider. For years, the Comanche had ruled this stretch of land like no other. Their horsemanship was legendary. Their ability to melt into the prairie and then erupt into a charge was unmatched. Their occasionally 10-foot-long lances, which were topped with iron or sharpened steel, were not merely decorative. They were a statement. We don't need bullets to kill you. They could run a man through before he ever had time to draw a bead, and more often than not, they did. But this fight would test both worlds. The cavalry had been riding for days, pushing deeper into Comanche territory than most white soldiers ever dared to go. General Sheridan had given orders to strike fast and strike hard that winter, catching the tribes when they were low on supplies. For the Comanche, winter wasn't a time of retreat. It was a time of pride, of defending their families against the invaders who thought the cold could slow them down. On that day, the column was led by Captain Eugene Carr. He wasn't new to the game. Carr had fought Indians before, and he knew better than to underestimate them. Riding alongside him were scouts who'd warned that the canyon ahead could be trouble. Canyons are tricky things. They have a way of swallowing sound, hiding movement, turning the hunter into the hunted. But the orders were clear, and the column moved in. The first sign of trouble wasn't a shout or a shot. It was the flicker of movement along the high rim of the canyon. Just shadows at first, shifting against the winter sky, then dozens of lance points caught in the sunshine. The Comanche were up there, waiting, watching. Carr's men tightened their grip on the reins. The Colts on their hips felt reassuring, but even in their hands, the soldiers knew the truth. The Comanche could close the distance in seconds. A revolver could fire 6 shots, sure, but reloading under the rush of a mounted charge wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible. That meant every shot counted. Then it happened. As though the canyon had given birth to them, the Comanche came down from the rim, their faces painted, their hair braided and tossed in the wind, their lances lowered like the jaws of a trap slamming shut. Their ponies were smaller than cavalry mounts, but quicker, darting in and out of range with a grace no army horse could match. The first clash was chaos. A soldier barely got his revolver out before a lance ripped past his arm, the point catching his sleeve and tearing through to the skin. Another man, steadier on his aim, fired point blank into a rider's chest. But before he could even lower his weapon, another Comanche swept past and knocked him clean from the saddle. The canyon was alive with noise now. Colts cracked, horses screamed, and men shouted to one another over the pounding of hooves. The frigid air was thick with the stench of black powder. Soldiers learned quick. Don't waste time aiming too carefully. The Comanche were too fast. You had to fire, shift, fire again, and pray you didn't run dry before the next rush came. But the Comanche weren't reckless. They'd surge in, strike with the lance, then pull back just out of range, circling like wolves around a campfire. Every pass was another test of nerve for the soldiers. Do you keep your aim steady, or do you fire too soon and waste your shot? Carr himself was in the thick of it, shouting orders to hold the line. At one point, a lance struck the side of his horse, the animal rearing wildly. Carr managed to stay in the saddle, pulling his revolver and firing into the rider's back as the Comanche wheeled away. For nearly an hour, the fight raged through that canyon, the two sides locked in a deadly rhythm. Rush, strike, retreat. The revolvers gave the cavalrymen a fighting chance, but the Comanche knew every inch of that land, every fold of the ground that could hide a rider until it was too late. Then came the turning point. One of the scouts, an old hand who'd fought alongside Pawnee allies in the past, spotted a narrow ledge along the canyon wall. If the cavalry could hold it, they could keep the Comanche from circling entirely around them. Carr didn't hesitate. A handful of men scrambled up, Colts ready, and began firing down into the flanks of the charging warriors. It didn't stop the Comanche entirely, but it broke the flow, forced them to rethink. By late afternoon, the canyon grew quiet again. The Comanche had pulled back, not defeated, but unwilling to lose more men in a fight that had turned against them. They disappeared into the rimlands as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving the soldiers to catch their breath and count the cost. The cavalry had held, but it had been close, closer than anyone cared to admit, and in the quiet afterward, as they tended to the wounded and reloaded their revolvers, the men couldn't shake the image of those lances flashing in the winter sun, closing the gap faster than any bullet could fly. The Canyon Fight of 1868 became one of those moments soldiers talked about for years afterward. It wasn't just about who won or lost, it was about facing an enemy who fought with a skill and ferocity you couldn't train for in a barracks. It was about the realization that a 10-foot lance in the right hands could be every bit as deadly as the finest revolver the army could issue. And for the Comanche, it was proof that even in the face of new weapons and new tactics, their way of war still had the power to rattle the men who thought themselves masters of the frontier. Somewhere out there, as the soldiers rode on, the Comanche were already planning the next fight. The canyon had only been the beginning.